Good evening. My name is Maria Howell, and I am Director of Alumni and Family Engagement and a proud member of the class of 1991. I am thrilled to welcome you all to an evening with Hilary Green, Reconciling Davidson College's Slave Past, Why Scipio, Torrence, and Hiram Matter. Dr. Hilary Green is an associate professor of history in the Department of Gender and Race Studies at the University of Alabama. She earned her PhD in history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her research and teaching interests include the intersections of race, class, and gender in 19th century African American history, the American Civil War era, Reconstruction studies, Civil War memory, and the Black Atlantic. She is the author of Educational Reconstruction, African American Schools in the Urban South, 1865 to 1890, as well as articles, book chapters, and other scholarly publications. She is the co-series editor of Reconstruction Reconsidered, a University of South Carolina Press series, a book review editor for the Journal of North Carolina Association of Historians, and a digital editor for Muster, the online blog for the Journal of the Civil War Era. In January 2015, she developed the Hallowed Grounds Project, which explores slavery, memory, and its legacy at the University of Alabama. In addition to several short publications, she is currently at work on a second book manuscript examining how everyday African Americans remembered and commemorated the Civil War. Davidson College is so lucky that Dr. Green is serving this year as Associate Professor of History and the 2020-2021 Vann Professor of Ethics in Society. Despite COVID, she is still physically present in the Davidson community, adding to the conversation. For those of you joining us, Dr. Green will give us a presentation about her work as a whole and her findings about Davidson's history in relation to slavery. We will then open it up to questions from the audience that you can place in the chat once we open that up. And now I have the distinct honor to present to you Dr. Hilary Green.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you for all in attendance for coming this evening. I know I appreciate you taking the time out to be here today. So what I want to present today is some of my preliminary research and work that I've done at Davidson thus far, but how it connects to my overall scholarship and my research more broadly on campus history, but also African American experiences during slavery, but more importantly, after slavery, and community-based studies for understanding how to have these difficult conversations. As stated in my bio, I'm the author of Educational Reconstruction, and with this book cover, the picture below really gets at the heart of my research that I do not only in my normal life before Davidson, but at Davidson. In my seminar, my research and service activities, I'm interested in the everyday person and the everyday African American from childhood to death, and how their contributions to history and their everyday actions matter in understanding the history of remembrance of slavery, slavery itself, but also the institutions they built in the afterlife of slavery. And I firmly believe that you can look at communities, whether it's a neighborhood to a city, to understand the state and the nation. So I do look at myself as interested in those people in that classroom, but also to the communities and those overlapping communities in which they identified with. I am teaching 2 courses in my time here. In the fall, my course on slavery, the university, and its complex legacies, students and I are doing a deep dive into what does this history of institutional enslavement look like, and what is Davidson's place in this larger question in history, and also in now with the report on the Commission of Race and Slavery, how the present and the current report, it helps inform current conversations. So our students look to the past to understand the college, its place in this larger history, for understanding the community and the present day conversations guided by that report. My students use that report as their first readings for the class. And right now we are reading these 4 books, Prince and Fugitive Slave, The University Court and the Slave, Ebony and Ivy, and we will end with the Slavery in the University anthology. And they are developing projects to really take, in the middle of the COVID pandemic, the work that has been digitized by the special collection archivists and the librarians. And I could not have done this project, or my students could not have done this work without the digital collections there. And the richness of those sources are allowing us to still have these deeper conversations about slavery. But as we do this work, it's difficult at times. And I warned students at the beginning of the course, I have to remind them, it is hard to do the research of its slavery and its afterlife at an institution in which you have personal connections with. Even though this is my second time at Davidson College, I was here fortunately for the symposium, which Melissa Fuentes gave the keynote address and shared some of my work. And now being back here for the full year, I'm glad to be back and be a part of this conversation. But now I'm part of this institution as well, even how brief. And even though the difficulty is hard, when you look at documents like this, and the euphemisms for slavery that are used, that are shared across all institutions of higher ed in the antebellum period and previously, of servant instead of slave. And seeing these hard documents and the costs associated and the use of tuition dollars and student fees, which is common across institutions. And looking at these documents that's cold and this coolness about institution, realizing there's people involved in this. So my students and I regularly grapple with these documents that are digitized, the larger scholarship, and now with the language and tools start to have some difficult conversations. But as we had going through this work and connected to the type of research I do, students are always asking, well, who were the enslaved people? What do we know about them? How do we get them from the dollar amounts that were exchanged between the college and the community that they were hired out? How do we get to know the people who made the bricks that were used in the buildings? How do we get to know those servants who were regularly hired to the school in faculty housing, helping the faculty and students? Who were they? What were their names? And what were their marks? So to think about this, I think about the persons and the people involved and who they are. And this is where that network of other schools doing this work matters. So one of the legacies that really the students were struck by and we had questions about from the very beginning came from the report itself, where it said, in his will, Chambers freed some 48 enslaved people, providing them supplies and money for passage to Oberlin, Ohio. He also encouraged some of the people who were free to go to Liberia. And the students like, well, who were they? So when I did a simple call based on the will, I was connected to my good friend, Kelly Mezarek, and others who have done research at Oberlin. And she's like, I have one of your people in my work of the 27th USCT Regiment. He came from the Davidson area, part of this will. He's a part of that will. The local community remember him. You should read William Bigglestone's book about this and personalize what we had in the Board of Trustees minutes, the fold out will that was published in the area, because this was a major request given to the school, and humanize that story. And Scipio Torrence is one of them, as well as the picture right there, that is Adelaide Chambers, who is one of the people who is named specifically in the Chambers will, and what happened to them, and what were their lives like in Oberlin. But for Scipio, he's not one mentioned a lot. His name briefly appears in the documents, and you don't really know what happened to him until you go into sources from Oberlin, and I was grateful that she shared with me some of the Oberlin archival records, including his service record for the USCT regiment that she studied, because he was known as Sip, and his wife Everline was known as Celine. And in 1856, they got married, and they lived in Oberlin, where they gave birth to several children. And 2 months before his son was born, perhaps because at the time during the Civil War, he enlists late in the Civil War, he gets a bonus of $500, and he needed that income to help supplement his growing family. He enlists in the 27th Regiment. But less than 21 days after he enlists as a healthy individual, he gets sick, and he's hospitalized and forced to be mustered home. And by early 1866, he is dead. And having the obituary for him that mentions Torrence and his legacy, and remember, formerly a slave. And then with Biggleson's record, the pension and others, able to trace some of that. So for students, we were able to answer quickly some of the questions about the Oberlin individuals. Some want to know more about the librarian individuals, but it only heightened more what happened to those who were directly tied to the school, who remained in the surrounding community. So from Scipio Torrence, something about the Oberlin legacy and others there, many of whom had the last name of Chambers and other familiar North Carolina names, who are buried in a very prominent historic cemetery in Oberlin. And those family connections, those ties are there for future exploration. But they wanted to know about this picture too, and some of the individuals named here. And that led to some of the work that I've been doing independently and adding to the students and helping them get materials additional to what has been supplemented using Ancestry.com that we have a subscription to, and my other tools in research in early African American history, developing more resources that are available digitally so they can have sufficient amount of information for a hybrid course, because half of them are in Davidson, half of them are virtual, but yet we meet every Monday morning at 8:05 and we talk about this material. So one of the individuals here, he's just mentioned as Holtzclaw. Well, it's Stanford Holtzclaw, and really figuring out who the man of this picture is, but also trying to figure out some of these. But Stanford Holtzclaw came quite early, because he was one that the students remembered him as points of satire, lampooning, someone where even though under emancipation, he was seen because of race as them. But yet they respected him enough that they would talk about him as a taskmaster, because he was kind of more like a supervisor of the various college servants. Students also question, I talk about the continued use of servant that was used under slavery, under freedom, and for paid employees, and what that might have done to the community, but also legacy. Who were still tied to the school, this was a really good, and it was one that they were able to build institutions from. So in this particular yearbook entry, Facultas Ebony, Holtzclaw is being lampooned for leading a faculty meeting among other paid employees of African American descent at the school. And it's in here, students wonder about, okay, we know how the school remembered him, but how did the community remember him? What was his household? And this is where the census records come in, and why he was easily identified, because for his employer, he put college employee and janitor. So being able to connect those things in there and corroborate the sources. But in the 1900 census, shortly after that photo was taken, we have additional insights of his wife, his stepson, and his daughter-in-law. Both his stepson had ties to the school, as well as his daughter-in-law and wife worked as washerwoman, taking care of the laundry of students and faculty at Davidson. So it's the whole household that has ties. Through one man, we got insights not only of how he was able to leverage economically and for himself and his household employment and wealth, but how he was noted in the community that he made sure college janitor was made on his record. The college ties were there. But also too, records of death are equally important because while census records and old yearbooks provide some clues, this death certificate of Stanford Holtzclaw that's contained in the North Carolina archives and that are available now through Ancestry.com and other digital sources reveals something else. He was a child when slavery ended. So his time at the school was probably very limited, if any, during the war years. But his parents, as Othra Johnson identified as the witness, were William Holtzclaw and Millie White. And at the time of his death, he was still married. But like other African Americans connected to Davidson, he was buried in the colored cemetery. And it's these clues, even in death, of another name of William Holtzclaw, a mother, and how he died, approximate age, and the like, that we can get a sense of the whole man, who he was, but also too, how people remembered him and made sure that other information, not in traditional Davidson sources, remembered him this way and not as someone to be lampooned. And it's through these sources where we can get some insights into some people. Hiram Potts is one of the few people who Susan and I have been able to identify. We can give a larger connection from slavery to the present. And this is an image of him that was posted in the yearbook as part of a collage. And you know, the difference between Holtzclaw and Hiram Potts is Holtzclaw was someone to lampoon, someone to make fun of him as a taskmaster. Uncle Hiram was like a part of the extended family that was Davidson, because he connected several generations of Davidson students. And his ties to slavery, we can connect to documents on enslavement at the school in the present records. And he was just Hiram there. But after slavery, he becomes Uncle Hiram. And how the students remembered him, how he's seen in the community, and even in his photograph here, is of a man to be respected and connected and someone to be admired. And Uncle Hiram, unlike Stanford Holtzclaw and his college servant, you could see there's a difference in here and how he was remembered differently. But what Uncle Hiram had in the yearbooks versus the census records reveals something completely different. He had a life completely outside of the school. And he is one of the few people we can connect from slavery to freedom and his connections to the surrounding community. He was married twice. His first wife will pass away. He will have several children. But he was a fixture, an institutional builder, a leader who is recognized just not by students and faculty and members at Davidson, but in the Black community writ large. And Uncle Hiram meant a lot to many people. Therefore, when he died, his death took notice. Unlike Stanford Holtzclaw, unlike some of the other African Americans, whether they were enslaved or as post-war employees, Uncle Hiram was honored in death by the community. And students gave him an elaborate eulogy in the student newspaper. And not only that, they made sure his slave ties were mentioned and who his connections were to the university to show from slavery to freedom to death, he was a part of the Davidson community writ large. But more importantly, they put up a headstone for him in the cemetery off of Ridge Avenue. And that cemetery there is interesting because this headstone, while honoring him, also got some information incorrect about his life. And this is where having his death certificate from the state and also other records, we know that he was born about 1838, not 1842. And that while his second wife was named Clara, his first wife was not named there, as well as his children. So one of the things I will be doing shortly with Dr. Strumlaw and others, we're going to be going over to the cemetery and seeing not only his gravestone, but who among his family are also dead, and where is his place and how is it looking there, but using the materiality in that of his headstone for this. But these are the two documents of all the documents and research my students and I have done that struck students the most, that got us to have a difficult conversation. This was about what does it mean that Davidson College has these slave ties? Because Uncle Hiram was not someone they really knew, but they knew Pot families. They knew from the other research who he was, and they're wondering, who are the descendants in our midst? How can we get them in these conversations? And this was one when I had those things about how difficult this work is at times and creative solutions. Students and I are talking about how to do this. So in their final projects, I have two students who are looking at Hiram Potts specifically and ways to tell his story more broadly to the wider community. One who's developing lesson plans for the Ada Jenkins Center and what can be incorporated in K through 12. One is also thinking about, because Uncle Hiram is used a lot in the yearbooks, what does it mean if we really go through Uncle Hiram Speaks and correct his biography and tell a simpler through the existing yearbook records and do a rewrite of those. Other students are looking at expanding the timeline that was in the commission report to add more about these people's names in there. Others are looking at the training of students. Some are trying to do the fuller biographies of Enoch, Baxter, and other people who we know were enslaved and then became paid employees. So one of the things that we are doing this semester is my students are developing public-facing projects that will be contained on the website Stories Yet to Be Told. This is going to be not just a grade that they're getting, but producing knowledge, and it'll be made accessible. In the spring, I'm teaching a course on African-American memory and really looking at the afterlife of slavery. What institutions did Uncle Hiram and others build, Hiram Potts and Enoch, others and Baxter build? What kind of churches, schools, and what is that? How did they remember slavery at the school differently than the college itself? And plan to develop some short biographies that could be put in the library of these individuals and making sure that archival material's there. But one of the things that I will be doing for sure is developing a COVID-safe exhibition showcasing the student projects of the fall and the spring. But one of the things also I've been doing, as I say, I am physically present. I do live in Davidson. I'm in faculty housing, and I'm regularly a part of the conversations, partnering with existing college initiatives for housing these projects and this research. So the conversation continues, even though my tenure is for this year. This is one of the things about doing slavery in this research and campus history. It's more than one person. We all have our role to play. And for this, adding this knowledge, adding these stories, these people, humanizing it is what is important as well. And that way we can move forward. So as I do this work, I definitely see the benefits of being at Davidson, being in this role, and being able to be at these conversations at an important starting point, because the hard work is done. Having an apology, having a commission report is more than what most schools do. But having these conversations, moving forward, having a plan to move forward is one of the things that gets me going and wakes me up in the morning. But honestly, it's every morning at 8:05 that I get to Zoom in with 10 students, and we are talking about the literature. We are having these difficult conversations, and we are always thinking about the past and the present, their part as the 21st century inheritors of this legacy, and what is their responsibility, and mine as well. So for us, it has been, and for me, it has been extremely important and groundbreaking and informative of my own research on community-based studies. So with that, I want to thank you, and I will be able to answer any questions that you have through the chat. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much to Dr. Green. I know that I have a lot of questions after your presentation, and I imagine that others do as well. We are now opening this up for Q&A, so please use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen and select chat to all panelists so that I can ask the questions of Dr. Green on your behalf. And I'll start with the first question that I have. What have been your first impressions of Davidson and Davidson students?
Honestly, I've loved the campus. Sadly, because of COVID, I haven't had an official tour of the campus, but that will be fixed next week. But I've walked the campus all the time. Their energy is amazing. The fact that they are energized, have read, and are willing to have this at 8:05 in the morning. I can't stress this enough. It is 8:05 in the morning on a Monday. And I know, coming from Alabama, after a football weekend, Monday mornings are tough for some people. So for us having these conversations, having those initial thoughts, I leave by 9:20. I have to stop the time because our time is done. I'm like, I can go on for hours with them. So I've been super impressed, and I am so loving my time here, and everyone has been amazing, from faculty to administrators to students. But every Monday, I look forward to that class.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. What has been the most difficult question that you've received from a student so far?
One of the most difficult questions is, why don't we have more documents about the life of the enslaved? And why isn't there a list of them? And I have to, but that difficult question, after reading other schools, especially with Ebony and Ivy, and now we're reading the Princeton Fugitive Slave, and now we're reading Al Brophy, they realize that wasn't something at the time people would have done. But they have also learned from the methods of other scholars, but also with my research, how to find these names. So now they see their work as more than just a grade. How to humanize this story, add them to this larger history, and find the documents that are existing, and also at the state archives and there to make sure those stories are told, because but they first were like, why don't we know more about this? So like, it's okay, we'll get to that question.
Questions are coming in fast and furiously here.
Yeah.
Can you share a little more about student reactions to learning about these individuals?
I could tell you, reading about other schools have been a problem. They're like, oh, now we understand where Davidson is. And Davidson's like other schools, and especially the antebellum period. They had the right criticisms of Ebony and Ivy. They're like, these are all northern schools, and all northern schools from the colonial era. What about us? And I'm like, thank you. You're asking the right question. So Hiram Potts and Scipio Torrence, where I put up those three, Scipio Torrance's obituary and the two selections from Hiram Potts, I could tell through our meeting that the mood had changed. This is when it became real, that it was people more than the casual references that they saw in the other documents or could quickly find over servants. These became people. And some of their work that they have done previously at Davidson for other classes, talking about the doing oral histories and others, and they're like, we know Potts' family. What? And they're like, is that this Potts? I'm like, that's a good question. Let's talk about this. But that's when it became real. And from then, it totally shifted, that they could see, as I was telling them, like, no, you are gathering information. You now know, you have an awareness. Now they are more attuned, and they're reading more and trying to find out and tease out more, because it went from abstract servant to this is a person. And that is one of the things that I've seen at Alabama, I've seen at other schools, and I've seen here. And it's that comment and that spark and that realization that by the time that hits, and it hit about the time I was expecting, they were ready.
That's great. That's so great. So you mentioned that it's when they came up with the person, when they learned the names, that it made a difference for them. With your research, have you been able to speak to any living descendants still living in and around Davidson?
This is where COVID is the reality of here. I have yet to be in the community as much as I wanted to. If this was a normal situation, I would be like, yay! But because of COVID, I haven't. But my goal is I know they're there. I know people are here. And this is why being physically present matters, and being able to do social distance meetings and Zoom, and being able to have these other things. Because in my spring course, I really want to move beyond slavery into those communities of freedom. And this is the way you can find some of the descendants. But my goal is always for this research is, can we identify the descendants still in our midst? And I know just from my previous research on educational reconstruction, I've had both descendants of some of the white administrators of the Freedmen's Bureau School contact me, to some of the students that I looked at in the 1870s. Their family is like, thank you, because I was looking for this person for here. You talked about my family member. So for me, doing that work, I know they'll come. I just don't know when. And I hope that COVID relaxes some, that we can actually have some more in-person discussions and actually engagement. But right now, the reality is such that I cannot.
Thank you. Someone said they wanted to know a little bit more about Davidson's connection to slavery. Questions around, did Davidson own slaves, and were slaves part of building Davidson College?
Yes, so one of the things about Davidson is like other schools. As a corporation, no, very few schools owned physically, actually are the corporate owners of enslaved people. What they did was hire them out. And this is the leasing system that most colleges are used. So they are hired out for a day, a month, a year. And what you see in the trustees' reports are the fees paid out to the enslavers. And in Alabama, sometimes we get the names of the enslaved people attached and then the enslaver. At Davidson, we just get the enslaver. But they are there. And they're using student fees, which is also a regular common feature. In terms of the building of the campus itself, yes. And this is where, from the bricks to actual construction, you can see the enslaved labor being used there. And that is typical of antebellum schools across the region. So Davidson's not unique there. One of the things that I always want to know, even for Alabama, like, who was on the construction crew? What were their names? Who were they? And what is their carpentry work that were done? And so can we identify the master carpenters who built some of the buildings here? What was some of that finer carpentry work and finer brick work that had to be hired to do, versus those who just moved bricks and, and dug foundations? So finding that sophistication will be there. And then also too, the names through faculty, because faculty and staff and presidents, they owned enslaved people. And as employees of the school, they used their enslaved people at the school. So for that, it's not the institution, it's the people. And then the faculty and their ties to slavery, and looking at the early alumni report of where the alumni come from. When you look at the schools involved, they are coming from largely UNC Chapel Hill and other institutions where slavery was also persistent. So their training is tied to slavery as well. And then what they're teaching at the school, like D.H. Hill's math book, with the math problem directly tied to slavery that they read about in not just Al Brophy's book, but other books. But that textbook that D.H. Hill produces is one that's on the board. I'm like, it's in all levels, to the literary societies, to the Baden societies. They are seeing those networks of people and how that goes to the ownership, the coming as students and the tuition dollars that allow them to come as students, to what they do as alumni. And they're seeing those larger webs. What they want now is what happened to the enslaved people. from the time of being property to the time of being paid employees and free people. So they would like to see the balance between the two. And that's where I think the field is going. And for them, that they are asking the right questions more so. Okay, we know slavery is here, but what about this other side?
Right, right. It's such a complicated web there.
Yes.
What have you learned about why Stanford and Hiram were viewed and portrayed so differently by students in the college?
One of the things I think is, though, I think Stanford, because he was a child at the end of slavery, so he comes in definitely as a paid employee, someone who's seen as a supervisor, someone who's at the top. And the relationship over generations of students weren't there. It just was not there. He's the one who's going to report back to the president if someone does something wrong. He's the one who's going to do the mean stuff. But Hiram was known for generations. So when you have fathers who attend the school and then their sons, and they can still talk about the same man and have shared communications and shared ties over those generations. So when you see a reminiscence from someone from pre-Civil War in the yearbooks, and they're talking about him versus a student later on, and then in death, you could tell it's because he was such a fixture in his long history, that institution of knowledge and that cross knowledge across time that helped. And so the question now is, how does that translate outside of the school? But Stanford is one that is a late arrival to the school, what I can tell. But even then, those slave ties tangential to school, it's the legacy part that you can really see with race with him.
We have a question in from someone who's noted some of the studies that you've done with intersections between race and gender. And so I'm wondering about what conversations are happening looking at the intersection of race and gender issues with Davidson.
Yeah, so this is one of the biggest frustrations of our students as well. As women do not appear often in records of enslavement, especially at antebellum schools. And that's because they're learning from previous schools what happens when there's a large presence of enslaved women, especially with sexual assault, payouts, and things like that. So women are limited to where they are. So oftentimes the few places we see with women at Davidson is because of their relationship to faculty and the presidents. It's in those households, it's in those documents that we see them, but we do not see them in the campus community. And then after slavery, we see formerly enslaved women, and also African-American women more broadly, are the washerwomen. They're doing the laundry service, they're doing that. So you hear about Aunt Mag through the student newspapers and talked about, is there another laundress we can reuse? Or, oh no, we have to use this one type of thing. But this is where the aunt comes in, like uncle. I'm like, okay, they're signifying the age here. They're signifying something different than Holtzclaw or someone just by their first name. And this is one of the things I'm seeing is the language choices, how they describe them have been very much about rhetoric, pronoun choices, and just aunt versus uncle, this versus here. But they only mention people whether they have direct ties with. They're not mentioning the larger community of Davidson outside of the school. So I think that's telling that they left enough of a mark that they are there. But as someone who does race and gender, I'm always looking for enslaved women. I'm like, where are you? What's your experience? And my forthcoming article that I have for the public historian on the cover that was on the slide, those are 3 enslaved women that I've been able to bring back into the narrative at Alabama, because not only did they work there, they were owned by the President Manley. They gave birth to children back there at the slave cabins. So for me, it's like they were mothers, they were workers. What happened to their children? And for me, I really would like to do that with some of the few enslaved women that are there. Who are their children? How are they grandparents? What are those relationships? And what did they do connected to this larger history? But their records are fewer than it is for enslaved men and boys, unfortunately.
Thank you. We have a question from a partner of an alum. Do you have a way you would recommend reaching out to my own alma mater to see if they have done this work? And if not, to encourage them to do so?
I will say more schools are doing this. The first thing I would look at are the University Study in Slavery. It is a consortium that came out of UVA, but this work has been going on really since the early 2000s, and they're growing. And there's more schools coming online. So I could tell you for the SEC and the football conference, Auburn, Georgia, Mississippi, I think Tennessee's about to come online, Alabama. We are all doing this individually. But one of the things is, if you don't talk to your institution provost, see what the faculty are doing. Because my work started as within a class and a student comment that came to my class. And I did this like, no, I can't have a student say slavery not exist at UA. We're going to change that. So let's do the research and we're going to use our classes. There's probably more faculty at your alma mater who are already doing this grassroots work in their own classes that hasn't been publicized. So you might want to reach out to the history department as well as the institution, like, who's doing this work? Are they doing anything here? Why can't we be like other schools that are doing this larger research here? But are there any faculty already doing the work? So I suspect there probably are faculty already doing that hard work in their classes.
This is an interesting question. How do you recommend the college acknowledge descendants of slaves owned by trustees and other Davidson personnel, faculty, or students?
One of the things that I really think of is the use of legacy status. We use legacy status a lot. I'm a legacy of Franklin Marshall College. My father went there as well as my mother. So I'm definitely a legacy student. And this is one of the untangible things that we don't have. We don't have a list. This is where locating matters. Locating the names here, having those identifications, and using that structure for there. Also to scholarships, aid, and the like. And I think we have some models that were done, but I think the easiest way would be that status, but also to think about monuments, building structures, things in art on campus. Because how can we incorporate those names in their time, their histories, more fully into the current landscape and the current present Campus A community too, other than just admissions and scholarships? What else can we do? And this is where one of the recommendations of the commission report was thinking about creative artwork. And I'm always thinking about this because I ask my students all the time at Alabama, once we have identified enslaved people, like, what should we do with these names? They're like, we need to say their names. We need them in places. But one of the things they insist upon, that they are eye level or higher. They do not want to have anything on the walkways where people walk on them. They're like, nope, they need to be eye level, that we can't ignore them. That we have to acknowledge their names, their time, that history, alongside the names already put on buildings in brick and in mortar. What about them? And doing that, and students, and I think this is where talking to the current campus community can get to some of those other artistic, creative, but sustainable ways. And then lastly, being upfront, digital memorials, digital content, having this information not behind paywalls that anyone can access it and learn that institutional history and learn about their families and their ties to the school, and really breaking down those barriers across all levels.
So along with some of those things that we can do to honor people in the present, how should we use this historical lens in the present? And are there specific questions you suggest that we, staff and faculty, ask ourselves as we critically explore Davidson College today?
Yeah, so that is a great question. This is what I tell people, this is a hard project. This is hard work because you're not the objective outsider anymore. You are in the community. You're part of this community and you have ties that are different. So for me, one of the things that I always think about is when I walk on Davidson, but also other schools tied to slavery, the first thing I always remember as a Black woman, I would not be able to be here if the history of the school was as such as before 1865. So I firmly acknowledge how far Davidson and other schools have gone from owning people, hiring out people, treating people as property, to the current day diverse communities of the present. And so for me, I'm like, so much progress has happened. I'm now part of this conversation. So it's not a past to ignore, not a past to hide. But I always think about whose shoulders am I standing on? How can I build to a better future from this past that came both white and Black before? And for me, it becomes a different type of, I am part of this community. This is my community. I'm part of this history at this time. How do I continue on this forward trajectory since post desegregation? And how do I learn from the past in a way to not make some of the decisions of the past that led us to some of these difficult times? So I'm more mindful. I'm also mindful of my classes. How do I teach this? So if I teach about slavery, why would I not talk about the college that I'm at and bring in those documents so it's not abstract anymore? I also talk about legacy and what does legacy mean for those at the school, but also legacy and town and gown relations. What can we be a good neighbor? How can we be a good neighbor? How can we be a good employee? The other thing I do is I always acknowledge all levels of staff and faculty at the school, regardless if they are the janitor or the groundsman. I always say hello. I always acknowledge. I remember that they are too. We are both Davidson. So that acknowledgement and the hello to the everyday practices of treating one another with respect and dignity, to reminding myself of whose shoulders I'm standing on to be here and how much school is radically different from that past. Gives me joy in knowing that something better can happen in the future. And how do I mark my time differently?
Thank you. A question about talking a little bit more about how historical documents, which can be somewhat objective in nature, can help inform our understanding of human beings.
Yeah, so this is one of the things for my students and I. We go through, we create not just, we don't rely just on one document. As a historian, we always try to cooperate with other documents. So for me, looking at a student regulation that I showed before from the student catalog of servant, I'm like, okay, who are the servants? How are that terms used and who are those people? First is that picture that featured Holtzclaw and others. I'm like, okay, who are these people in here? What are their first and last names? Not just the last names. What are their first and last names? Are there employee records? How can we fill out so we can go from that picture? But more importantly, I have a picture of what they look like. So it's not this word on a page, it's abstract, and I'm trying to figure out, and like, who are they? I have a visual now. And that visual helps in the humanization. So when I look at the census records, they're not words on a page anymore. And then when you see husband, wife, stepson, daughter-in-law, I'm like, he's a family man. He's a father. He's a husband. He's also in this picture here. It's that collection of sources together that I find that's there. So for our students is we always try to tell as much of a complete story as possible. We don't just pick and choose the sources that we use. We really, the hardest thing is we try to find as much as we can. And based on that, have to say, you know what, based on what we have, this is what we know. Sadly, the archives don't allow us to go into this, but we do know at this time, at this space, this is what they did. And that language, and this is where the Princeton Fugitive Slave, that book in particular, about a biography of one African-American man from slavery to freedom, students started to realize when they got to those archival gaps, they're like, how do we deal with the gap? And then they saw that, they're like, I now know. And they're using that like, we do know this. And then their footnotes are huge. And they're like, just footnote it. Just footnote as much as we can. And hopefully more information will come out. Right?
Wow. A question about spiritual lives of what we know and what you've learned about them from both slaves, former slaves, as well as college students and staff during the 1800s before and after emancipation. That's a big question.
Yes. Yes. So one of the things, and especially with the work that I've been doing and also the other works as well, sermons. A lot of ministers who are college presidents and faculty, the sermons that they are given to students, but also to out in the community, and clues of spiritual sung by enslaved people, because sometimes someone will comment on what song they're singing. I'm like, I know that lyric. Okay, I know they're singing here. But one of the things after slavery that's really interesting, because for most of our documents, we know what the Presbyterian Church is doing and the trustees and that and I think here continuing afterwards and using the publications of the Presbyterian Church, because one of the HBCUs I look at with Alabama is Stillman College, which still exists. It is a Presbyterian HBCU in Tuscaloosa. The land in which the current college is on was a former plantation of a woman who rented enslaved people to the school. So this is an institution of higher ed for Black children and ministers on the site in a Presbyterian school on the site of a former plantation tied to the school. And they see those connections. They're like, there's something about spirituality and ministers and the like. But the one thing is, most former enslaved people tied to universities and colleges do three important things after the Civil War. They are institution builders. They are the ones who have the money and the land to donate for churches and schools. And the second one, they oftentimes, and one of the things that surprised me, a lot of people in this area become farmers. So you need land, you need people with a spirituality to become those first ministers and become those first teachers. And one of the things I'm hoping to find in the second half of the course, looking at the Freedmen's Bureau records and others, is how many people with ties directly to Davidson are the first teachers and the first in the larger Davidson and surrounding community. Because my understanding and knowledge of other campuses, that's usually the norm, not a rarity.
I expect we will find that here too. Several questions have come in around naming. The initial action steps announced that the Board of Trustees is establishing a committee to review naming policies and the names of key spaces. What are your thoughts about renaming buildings, or how to go about determining how to acknowledge the history that exists there?
Yeah, so this is a question that is going across all college campuses. So when I saw the report, I'm like, yep, because right now the University of Alabama is also going through this process as well, and it is difficult and uneasy. So one of the things to look at is, what were the values of the intent of the people who put up buildings, and also to what is the history? Is a building, can it be renamed, or do you need to update the lobby to tell the full history? And I'm thinking about what happened at UNC Chapel Hill with Saunders Hall when they renamed it Carolina Hall. The whole front lobby became, this was Saunders. This is also slavery. Here is here. So create visually a mini museum in the middle of that, redoing plaques. There's a lot of things that are possible. Not all buildings need to be renamed. Some do, but one of the things you can do is update how the narrative surrounding each building. So if a building name remains the same, does the text describing who that person is need to stay on the website? Do they need a new plaque? So for me, I always look at, what does the community of this moment, through meetings, town and gown relations, submissions done, all those voices heard. It's not a top-down solution. It's one that everyone has a say in. But I think there'll be opportunities for new lobbies, new plaques. Can we have two names on a building? So Maxwell Chambers and some of the people from Oberlin, can we have other names? What's here? How can we transform the space to make it fuller inclusive, rather than the history that silenced the other past that people are finding objectionable now? That's where I think the harder part is, because removing a name is easy. add a new monument is easy. The harder conversation is, what do you do with that legacy and past for the present and the values that it reflects? That's the hard part. So for the committee, I sympathize for them because they have a hard job to do. But history, listening, empathy, because you're going to hear people who their relationships with building is completely different than others. All those voices matter. And in the end, whatever decision made reflects the community of the present. And then you just update accordingly.
Thank you. And we have time for one last question. We have many more questions, questions in the chat right now. So for everyone who is interested in learning more as more research is compiled, how can they follow your progress? Some people have asked for your reading lists, etc.
So one of the things I'm doing, the Stories Yet to Be Told initiative at Davidson, a syllabus will be there, as well as student projects will be posted there. So everything that my students and I are doing for the year will be stored there, plus at the archives, including a collective annotated bibliography that my students and I came up with. So I'm always thinking about long-term and legacy. The other is I am on Twitter, and occasionally I tweet out some of the documents that I have found, and it says Hilary Green 77, and you can follow me that way. But I am very open in sharing my work, and in the spring, my goal is to have a public event with some of those documents and everything else there, and to have if not a COVID social distance, I'll be masked as much as possible for microphone. We'll have these conversations, but it will have a home in the archives and at that site as well, because I want to make sure people in the future can also access that material.
Well, thank you so much to Dr. Green for spending this time with us this evening. I've learned so much. I'm sure others have as well. And this presentation has been recorded. It will be placed on our YouTube channel in the next few days once it's been captioned. Please feel free to share this with others and keep your eyes out for Dr. Green's latest essay in The Public Historian, coming out November 2020. Also, if you wish to continue the conversation, please watch the slides after the presentation for more information about where to go to find out more information. And in addition, see the slides for ways to stay engaged with Davidson and other upcoming events sponsored by Alumni and Family Engagement. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and thank you particularly to Dr. Green. I wish we were all together tonight so you could be hearing our applause. Thanks so much. Take care, everyone.